Disclaimer, I played Bramble on the Xbox Series X and will talk about it in the context of me doing so. Any performance or glitch issues may be different. I'll try to indicate when I talk spoilers, but beware, footage may be considered spoiler heavy. An additional warning as well, this game contains a lot of like gore and like bad things happening. If that's not your type of thing, proceed at your own discretion. Bramble was developed by Dim Frost Games and released on all major platforms on the 23rd of April 2023. Bramble is a hard game for me to describe. One could call it a puzzle adventure game, call it a walking sim or a horror game. It's really hard for me to categorize and define its genre. One thing is for certain, that the game, from what I can tell, is heavily inspired by Scandinavian folklore. So if there by any chance is someone who's watching from one of the Scandinavian countries watching this review who has played the game as well, feel free to leave a comment about your own experience with the game and if you felt sort of any special connections with the game because of your heritage or culture. I'm just really curious to see how it resonated with that audience, which I feel may be more of a primary audience than I was. But that out of the way, let's get into the review proper. Bramble has a simple yet beautiful art style in my opinion. It's almost able to captivate the player using its storybook-like art design combined with the way it handles graphics. It can create this fairy tale-like aesthetic just from the viewpoint of the player. One aspect I was left in awe by was some of the backdrops you would walk in front of. There is a stark contrast, however. The beauty, the wonder, the mystique of the daytime forest really make the player feel like they're in a happy type of fable. This contrasts the dark horrors that haunt the forest at night and some of the areas like the swamp, the troll forest, etc. I really think it's this subversion that defines Bramble as a game. Now in terms of gameplay, I feel like this is the weakest point of the game, but it's not really what the game is going super hard for, if you know what I mean. So the game is trying to tell you a story, give a message, invoke emotions in the player that really couldn't be felt if you didn't feel powerless. Having said that, the game's general gameplay is weak in my opinion. It would be good to describe what the gameplay consists of. There are numerous stealth sections in the game. Again, as I said before, you could describe Bramble as a puzzle game, as a lot of it is just solving different puzzles, but I'll get to that later. There isn't any real combat or enemies in the game that you can kill apart from the bosses. There's an orb that Ole, the main character, holds in his position, is able to push back the purple thorns of Bramble, which is the centerpiece of many puzzles in the game as well. There was a few repeated sections which I was a bit disappointed by because the game's short length. What I mean by repeated is I don't mean full repeated, but the actual puzzle mechanic of it is exactly the same. For example, there's this part where there's something traveling under a floor of gore and blood. And if that something reaches Ole, he will be dragged under and die. What you have to do is walk onto this pile of gore from a high ground to high ground to ensure that this monster doesn't reach you. This, however, is done again in water and other parts later on in the game, which was a bit disappointing. Now in terms of the puzzles themselves, none of them were particularly difficult or thought-provoking. Coming from me, as I said in my Cocoon review, I'm typically not the puzzle type of gamer. In terms of variety of the puzzles, as I said before, there were some repeats, but in general there was a distinct mix of them in each chapter. Like the alchemy puzzles later on in the game, there was, the puzzle with the Bramble, the stealth puzzles, not really remarkably challenging beyond getting a basic understanding of what you're supposed to be doing. In terms of boss fights, there is a few, I wouldn't call them particularly difficult, but I do have to hand it to the team. The game had me in suspense for a lot of them because they were very creepy. Some of the deaths that could happen were very hard to watch and gruesome. The mechanics of the boss fights, each distinct and unique between each other, but none were really remarkable. One aspect I really liked was the storybooks you could find around the game that do some of the explanations for the backstory and the folklore of some of the bosses in the fight. It was very helpful for someone who isn't familiar with the culture or folklore, so I found all the stories interesting. Another aspect that had happened with some of the bosses that you could see them in the background before they actually attack you. Kind of like a horror film, if you're astute enough you can see the jump scare coming. Speaking of horror, now, did the Bramble scare me? Yes it did. Now keep in mind, horror of course is very subjective and different people find different things scary. For someone like me who enjoys a lot of horror films and know what scares me, I'm gonna try explain how Bramble achieved what it did in its own words. For the record, not a lot of jump scares really get to me more than a jump or like a jolt. Not really scary. Suspense by itself also doesn't really scare me either. The combination of both, of knowing what's coming, being unable to stop it, however, is something that does get to me. And this game 100% does this exceptionally. It's funny because in the Ghostwire Tokyo review I did. I feel like one of the things that didn't make the game scary, turned down horror, was the power fantasy that kind of took away from that overwhelming fear. However, in Bramble, you're not strong at all. There is no power fantasy. You're just a little kid in a giant world where everything wants to kill you. It's much more terrifying because of this. I talk about Bramble builds atmosphere and using sound and music later, but in general, if you are a horror fan, this game may just surprise you. Now, the story of the game was pretty simple at a fundamental level. Two kids who go out in the middle of the night and end up in a big fantastical world where one of the kids gets taken and it's the other kid's job to go on this long journey to save them before they're killed. There may be some greater significance to the story to someone who knows the folklore more thoroughly or grew up around it, but the actual story of Bramble outside of the two kids, Ole and Lillimore, does require me to spoil the game a bit, so I'll leave a timestamp for you to skip if you don't want to hear that. So from my understanding, there's the whole story of the king and the actual bramble thorns that gets revealed throughout the game as well. More and more context is added why the world is like this. I really liked how the overall story was portrayed and each of the monsters' side stories kind of in each chapter or part of the game. I felt the game knew the stories it wanted to tell extremely well and drew a lot of inspiration from them to craft an excellent experience for players. I really liked how Ole changed as a character over time. For example, he's not the same little kid from the beginning of the game when he encounters the butcher, and it's like a very scary encounter. It just kind of comes out of nowhere, as when he encounters the king and he has to be able to save his sister right there and then. There was many difficult moments throughout the game where it's difficult for the player to watch. It's a relatively shorter game as well, so I don't want to fully go into this, whole story aspect of it. I really think it does have something special to offer. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the review, I really like how Bramble utilizes sound and music to really emphasize the tone it's going for. One thing that you might find out about how I like these type of horror experiences that I really like when a horror game, horror movie, horror TV show, etc. know how to use silence properly. Not many things really know how to do it. Silence of no music, just footsteps or just, the crackling of fire in the background, this kind of stuff, or ambient sound in the background. I really like how Bramble does this very well. It knows when to do it, because there is times where it is good to have like a nice music in this very nice intense overall experience at both times. And I feel like a contrast what I was talking about before, how there's this whole part about beauty of nature, the mystique of nature, but then there's also part of like the horrors of what the world truly has to offer, the evil that exists just out there in nature, the evil of humanity, each of these monsters out in this world that want to kill you. Overall, Bramble was a short but intense experience. Get it done in a day. It took me about 6 hours, though I did go through and get some of the small details and collectibles. Would I recommend Bramble to just anyone? No, as I said, if you aren't prepared for how dark the game gets, we don't like stuff like gore or like bad stuff happening around, I'll just say give the game a pass, because you might not be able to handle it. If you're a horror fan or you're into more of a darker territory with your games, then I definitely say Bramble is a good pickup on either Game Pass, on sale, or in general, if you have the means to. If you want to support that dev, pick it up at full price, pick it up on sale. I really enjoyed my experience of the game, regardless if I expected it to go to the places it went. As a reminder, I don't give review scores to just standalone games or that are not a part of a franchise, so Bramble will not get a score because I feel like it wouldn't be fair to it. Basic pros and cons list coming up. Pros: amazing use of sound and music to convey atmosphere, really dark story, which I think if you're a horror fan you'll really like, a simple yet beautiful, distinct art and design aesthetically. It was really able to strike at that horror vein for me in particular, and even get me spooked a lot of times, and it did not overstay its welcome in terms of its length. Cons: gameplay was on the weaker side in my opinion, even for this type of game. The puzzles were weak, which was really noticeable, especially when there were repeats. Didn't really like any of the stealth type puzzles at all, just as a side note or a side con. That's it for this video. Hopefully I'll be able to drop a review every week from now on. I was busy for a while, so I apologize for no uploads recently. Don't worry, 3 shorts a week, 1 review a week. Anime reviews will be coming up hopefully in some time in the future. Don't worry, all that stuff is still happening. So if you want that kind of stuff, like, subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I want to grow this. I want to thank you for watching this video to the end. Hope to see you in the next video.